Hello, friends. Welcome to the other side of history, where logic simply turns off. Do you think everything in our world can be explained, and that coincidences are just trivial? Well, that's not the case. I have stories that prove our world is one big madness. Here we've gathered tales of incredible luck, crazy decisions, and events that changed everything, yet somehow have been forgotten. We're starting a series after which you will understand that reality is much wilder than any fiction. Friends, we've reached 2,000. I want to say a huge thank you to each of you. I'm incredibly pleased to have you here with me. Please support this video with a like, and I'd love to know where you're watching from. Write your city in the comments. Let's begin. Story number 1. The prankster's will that turned childbirth into an Olympic event. Imagine Toronto, the year 1926. A gloomy day when the respected lawyer and financier Charles Vance Miller left this world. His colleagues and relatives gathered in the notary's office with somber faces, expecting a boring division of stocks and real estate. They knew Miller as a successful businessman, but few realized that inside this respectable gentleman lived the most sophisticated troll of his time. Charles considered human greed the funniest vice, and decided to stage a show for one last time, a ticket to which cost him his entire fortune. As the notary began to read the will, silence in the room turned into confused whispers, followed by muffled cries of outrage. Miller distributed his assets with exquisite mockery. He bequeathed the shares of a brewery to the three most zealous teetotaler clergymen who had battled against alcohol their whole lives. The shares of the racetrack went to opponents of gambling. Each of them had to choose, take the loathsome, sinful money or reject the wealth. Miller was likely chuckling in his grave, imagining their agony. But that was just a warm-up before the main attraction. At the end of the document lay a clause that later journalists would dub the Great Derby of Heirs. Miller bequeathed the remainder of his enormous fortune, an amount equivalent to millions of dollars today, to the woman from Toronto who, in the 10 years following his death, would give birth to the most children. At first, this was taken as a joke. Lawyers tried to contest the will, calling it immoral and contrary to public order. But Miller was an excellent lawyer. The document was flawlessly drafted. And then history knocked on the door. 3 years after the prankster's death, the Great Depression hit. The joke suddenly ceased to be funny and transformed into the only chance for salvation for dozens of families on the brink of poverty. Thus began the strangest race in Canadian history. The poor districts of Toronto were struck by a demographic fever. Women who might have been satisfied with 2 or 3 heirs in normal times turned motherhood into a strategic business plan. Newspapers published leaderboards as though it were a hockey championship. Bookmakers accepted bets. The society was divided. Some condemned greed, while others saw mothers as heroines trying to secure a future for their children during hard times. Nature, of course, implemented its own adjustments. There were those who gave birth to twins, but also those who faced stillbirths or couldn't conceive at all. The conditions were harsh. Only children born in legitimate marriages and registered in Toronto were counted. After 10 years, in 1936, the finish line was crossed. The court had to determine the winner. Emotions ran high. In the end, the grand prize had to be shared. 4 women, Annie Smith, Kathleen Nagel, Lucy Timlick, and Isabel McLean, each gave birth to 9 children over 10 years. Each received a significant sum that allowed them to buy homes, educate their children, and forever forget about poverty. 2 other women, who had some stillborn children, received consolation prizes. Charles Miller wanted to mock greed and Puritan morality, but ultimately his cynical stunt saved dozens of children from hunger and provided a comfortable life for several large families. He proved that even from the grave, one can rule a city if one has a sense of humor and a checkbook. This is a story about how one signature on a piece of paper changed the demographics of a metropolis. But our next hero had neither money nor legal education. He had only one desire: to disappear so completely that not even the most powerful army in the world could find him. For that, he had to turn his home into an impregnable fortress that he carried with him. By the way, friends, For those who are curious, I left links to all the primary sources in the description. Check them out and let's continue. Story number 2. A Man Who Became a Tree. France, 1915. The Western Front had turned into a meat grinder, where a soldier's life was measured in minutes. No man's land, a strip of mud between the trenches of the Germans and the Allies, was the deadliest place on the planet. Any movement there was met with immediate punishment. A sniper's bullet or an artillery barrage turned the living into memories. Generals needed information. They needed to see what was happening in the enemy camp. But how could one get close when every inch was under fire? The solution found by British engineers sounded like the crazy idea of a mad carpenter, but it was a brilliant act of military surrealism. They decided to send a spy to the front lines, not hiding behind cover, but inside nature itself. In the twilight, when the cannonade momentarily subsided, a group of artists and engineers emerged onto no man's land under the command of Solomon J. Solomon, a man who had painted portraits of aristocrats before the war and was now engaged in camouflage. Their goal was one specific war-torn tree. A dry willow, shattered by a shell, had stood in the field of death for several months, becoming a familiar sight to both sides of the front. The Germans had grown accustomed to it. It had become part of the landscape. Under the cover of night and the noise of distracting artillery fire, the engineers did the unimaginable. They cut down the real tree and dragged it away to the rear, leaving in its place, centimeter for centimeter, an exact replica. It was not wood. It was a hollow tube covered with the bark of a real tree, painted by artists with photographic accuracy. Inside this trunk, it was cramped, like a coffin, but there was an armored seat, a periscope, and a telephone cable leading underground. Just before dawn, an observer would crawl into the steel capsule. A door, disguised as a piece of bark, would slam shut. Morning arrived. Imagine the soul of this soldier. You are sitting inside a narrow metal tube in the middle of a field where the bodies of your comrades are rotting. The German positions are only a few dozen meters away. You can hear their conversations, smell their tobacco and strife. Through tiny holes, you see all their movements and whisper coordinates to artillery over the phone. One awkward movement, one glint of a lens, one sneeze, and the tree will become your grave. The Germans, realizing the tree is watching them, would not just shoot at it, they would blast it to pieces with heavy artillery. The shift lasted from dawn to dusk, sometimes even for a full day. Inside the steel tree, it was sweltering in the summer, like an oven, and in winter the metal sucked warmth from your body. You couldn't go to the toilet, you couldn't stretch your legs. It was torture of immobility in the center of a hurricane. These observation posts, known as OPs, stood at the front for years. The Germans, by the way, also came up with this idea, and sometimes, on the battlefield, two fake trees silently watched each other while people died around them. It was a war where even nature wore steel armor. This soldier survived by becoming absolutely motionless, merging with the landscape. But for our next hero, surviving required doing the exact opposite. He had to run. Run for so long and through such terrain that even camels collapsed in exhaustion, while drinking anything a normal person wouldn't dare bring to their lips, even under the threat of a gun. Story number 3. A Cocktail of Bats and Mad Hopes. Morocco, April 1994. The Sahara Desert. Imagine a place where the sun doesn't just shine, but tries to annihilate you. This is where the Marathon des Sables begins, a sandy marathon. This is not just running, it's 250 kilometers of hell, divided into 6 stages. Participants sign papers in advance indicating where to send their bodies in case of failure. Among the brave souls is Mora Prosperi, a 39-year-old Italian policeman and pentathlete. He is in great shape, confident, and ready to conquer the dunes. But the Sahara had other plans. On the 4th day of the competition, the horizon vanished. A sandstorm began, so fierce that it stripped skin like sandpaper. Visibility dropped to 0. According to the rules, a participant must stop and wait for help. But Mora, fearing being buried alive, decided to keep moving. He wrapped scarves around his face and ran for 8 straight hours, thinking he was heading for the finish. When the wind calmed, he discovered he was in an absolute, deafening void. The landscape had changed beyond recognition. There were no tracks, no landmarks. He was alone on a planet made of blistering silicon. He had half a bottle of water left for the next 9 days. What happened next felt like a hallucination. Mora was walking. When the water ran out, he began to drink his own urine, a classic survival tactic, effective only for a short time. But soon his body stopped producing liquid, and then he stumbled upon an abandoned Muslim marabout, a tiny tomb in the midst of the sands. Hope flickered and faded. There were no people inside, no well, but bats were nesting under the ceiling. Hunger and thirst erased the boundaries of disgust. The Italian officer, used to pasta and espresso, turned into a predator. He caught bats with his hands, tore off their heads, and drank their blood. It was a thick, nauseating liquid, but it provided him with moisture and protein. He sucked the innards of these winged creatures to avoid dying. He spent 9 days in the desert. He saw mirages, rescue helicopters passing overhead, oblivious to the tiny dot on the sand. He tried eating lizards and beetles. His liver was nearly failing. His eyes sunk in, and his weight dropped by 15 kilograms. His skin darkened and cracked, making him resemble a mummy. Eventually, he saw a young girl. He thought it was just another mirage, but she was frightened by his appearance and ran away. Mora stumbled after her and reached a campsite of Tuareg nomads. It turned out he had strayed nearly 300 kilometers off the marathon course. Moreover, he had crossed the border and was in Algeria, a country with tense relations with Morocco. The first thing the border guards did when they brought the half-dead runner to them was blindfold him, suspecting him of espionage. Mara Prosperi did not just survive. A few years later, he returned to the same marathon and completed it. Apparently, he wanted to make sure the desert wouldn't catch up with him this time. Mora battled the silence and loneliness that drove him to madness. But the heroes of our next story faced the opposite problem. They were engulfed by an epidemic that forced people to make sounds against their will. And this virus turned out to be more contagious than the plague. Story number 4. Laughter that made you want to cry. Tanganyika, now Tanzania, January 30th, 1962. Imagine a missionary boarding school for girls in the village of Kashasha, a place of strict rules, starched collars, and reverent silence. The students sat at their desks, listening to the monotonous voice of the teacher. Outside, the humid African heat persisted. Inside, discipline was stretched taut like a string. Nothing foreshadowed trouble, except perhaps boredom. Suddenly, 3 students began to giggle. At first, it was just a regular stifled laugh, familiar to any student trying not to laugh at the most inappropriate moment. The teacher frowned, demanding silence, but the girls did not stop. Their laughter grew louder, turning into hysterical giggles that brought tears to their eyes. They gasped for breath, clutching their bellies, and fell to the floor, trembling in convulsions of mirth. But there was no joy in their eyes. There was fear. They couldn't stop. What had begun with 3 teenagers instantly turned into a wildfire. The virus spread to the neighboring desks. An hour later, the entire class was laughing. By evening, the epidemic had spread throughout the dormitory. 95 out of 159 girls were affected by this strange ailment. It was no light and pleasant laughter. It consisted of fits that lasted anywhere from several hours to 16 days. The girls screamed, cried, and rolled on the ground. Some lost consciousness from exhaustion. The school administration was horrified, and the doctors shrugged their shoulders. There were no physical causes, no viruses or bacteria. On March 18, 1962, the school had to be closed. The girls were sent home to their parents, hoping that in their familiar surroundings they would calm down. This turned out to be a fatal mistake. The girls carried the contagion back to their villages. In the village of Anshamba, where several students returned, the epidemic flared up anew, affecting 217 people. Not only children laughed, but also adult men and women. People abandoned work in the fields, unable to prepare food or sleep. The epidemic spread to thousands of people in the vicinity of Lake Victoria. 14 schools were closed. The The phenomenon lasted for a year and a half. Scientists would later call this a mass psychogenic illness, a collective hysteria triggered by the stress of the clash between traditional African customs and the rigid European education system. The adolescent psyche couldn't withstand the pressure and found the only available release: uncontrollable, terrifying animal laughter. Nature played a cruel joke here, proving that even the most positive emotion can become a torment when the stop button is removed. In Tanganyika, people lost control over their emotions, but our next hero lost something far more tangible: his right to rest in peace after death. He was exhumed not for science or reburial, but to be tried to the fullest extent of the law. This trial would become the darkest farce in the history of religion. Story number 5. The defendant, who was decaying right in the courtroom. Rome, January of 897. The Eternal City is plunged into a grim medieval era, where the intrigues of the Vatican are sharper than the daggers of hired assassins. A trial is being prepared in the Lateran Basilica, the main cathedral of the Western world. Cardinals, bishops, and nobles have gathered. The air is heavy, not from holiness or fear, but from a nauseating odor that even thick incense cannot mask. All eyes are fixed on the throne where the defendant sits. He is dressed in luxurious papal robes, a tiara on his head, but his face is gray-green and his eye sockets are empty. The defendant remains silent for justifiable reasons. He has been dead for 9 months. This event will go down in history as the Cadaver Synod, the most macabre farce in the history of the Catholic Church. Pope Stephen VI, consumed by paranoia and hatred toward his predecessor, Pope Formosus, ordered the exhumation of his body to try him to the fullest extent of canonical law. The corpse was taken from its sarcophagus, dressed in silk and gold, and placed upon a throne. To keep the body from falling, it was tied with ropes. Nearby stood a trembling deacon, terrified, whose task was to answer questions on behalf of the deceased. Imagine the absurdity of this scene. The living Pope Stephen runs around the throne, spitting and yelling at the decaying body. "How dare you usurp the throne of St. Peter?" The deacon, stammering, tried to imitate the voice of the deceased, offering justifications, but Stephen was relentless. The court found the corpse guilty. The punishment was fitting for the madness of the trial. The Pope's garments were stripped from the corpse, leaving it in rags. 3 fingers from the right hand were severed, the very fingers with which the Pope would grant blessings, but even that was deemed insufficient. The examined body was dragged through the streets of Rome amidst the jeers of the crowd and thrown into a mass grave for foreigners. Later, it was exhumed and tossed into the Tiber, as if the irony of fate, or divine intervention, lay in the fact that during this blasphemous synod, an earthquake shook the walls of the basilica. The Romans took this as a sign. Soon, Stephen VI was overthrown and suffocated in prison. The body of the long-suffering Formosus was retrieved by monks and reburied with honors. The Vatican tried to forget this episode as a bad dream, officially banning the judgment of the dead in the future. Apparently, it was decided that the deceased already had enough problems in the afterlife without earthly attorneys. Pope Formosus became a victim of political theater, where the main backdrop was his own death. However, our next hero was the director of a different kind of theater. He sold tickets to a paradise that existed only in his imagination and forced hundreds of people to board a ship and sail to a land that never appeared on any map. Story number 6. The Prince of the Non-Existent Empire. London, October 1822. In the upper echelons of British society, only talk circulated about the mysterious hero who had arrived from South America. His name was Sir Gregor MacGregor. He was tall and stately, his chest adorned with medals and his manners impeccable. He called himself the Cacique, the supreme ruler of the Principality of Poitiers. None of the bankers and aristocrats in London had any idea where this Poitiers was located, but MacGregor spoke so convincingly that to doubt the existence of this earthly paradise became bad form. MacGregor launched perhaps the boldest marketing campaign of the 19th century. He claimed that Poitiers was a thriving colony on the Mosquito Coast, a modern Honduras, According to his colorful brochures and even a specially published book written under a pseudonym, the rivers were teeming with gold nuggets, the soil yielded crops 3 times a year, and the local Indians were so friendly that they eagerly awaited the chance to serve British gentlemen. In the capital of Poye, the city of St. Joseph, an opera house, a cathedral, and a parliament building were supposedly already standing. Hysteria gripped London. Investors, excited by the recent successes in colonial trade, brought their savings to MacGregor in bags. Scottish Highlanders sold their farms to buy land in Poye. MacGregor was selling not just plots, he was selling government positions, ranks in a non-existent army, and even currency, the Poye dollar, which he printed at a nearby printing house. He amassed a sum equivalent to billions of pounds today. In 1823, 2 ships, the Honduras packet and the Kennersley Castle, with 250 colonists on board, set sail for the promised shores. People brought their finest dresses, grand pianos, and dinner sets as they prepared for high society life in the tropics. Upon their arrival, they were met with the deafening silence of the jungle. There was no town of St. Joseph, no port, no opera, no roads. Only a wild, swampy shore, swarming with mosquitoes and crocodiles. The friendly natives turned out to be a small group of indigenous people who watched with surprise as the white folks disembarked into the marsh with a piano. The harsh reality hit the settlers with the blows of malaria and yellow fever. There was no gold in the rivers, and the fertile land was unfit for farming without clearing the ancient forests. The colonists began to die. They hoped for help from MacGregor, believing the captain had simply mistaken the bay, but help never arrived. Of the 250 souls, fewer than 30 survived. They were saved by a passing ship from British Belize. When the news reached London, MacGregor had already fled to Paris, where he tried to pull the same scam once more. Amazingly, he never faced any serious consequences and died in his bed in Venezuela, collecting a general's pension. Gregor MacGregor sold people air, disguised as paradise. Our next story features heroes who managed to lose not money, but an entire army, and they didn't even need an enemy. A single barrel of schnapps and a language barrier were enough. Story number 7. The battle won by 3 barrels of schnapps. Austria, May 17, 1780. Before dawn, on the outskirts of the town of Karash by the Timish River, the Austrian army prepares for an assault. They believe an enemy force of the Ottoman Empire lies hidden somewhere across the river. Scouts reported the presence of Turks, and today they will destroy them. In reality, there were no Turks nearby, not a single one. The Ottomans were still preparing to advance on another part of the front, but the Austrian soldiers were unaware of this. The camp buzzed with lively anticipation. Officers distributed schnapps to boost morale before the fight. German soldiers, known for their toughness, benefited from a few rounds of alcohol. They grew louder, bolder, and, as it turned out later, completely incapable of distinguishing friend from foe. Dividing into groups to cross the river and trap the enemy, the soldiers began crossing the Timish. One group, having crossed over, decided they had come upon the best spoils, 3 barrels of that very combat schnapps left on the shore. They opened one barrel and began to drink, laughing heartily. Soon, another group of Austrian soldiers, hearing the commotion, assumed that the Germans had already begun to loot. They rushed towards the barrels, shouting, "Germans, quick! They're drinking our spoils!" A scuffle broke out. The soldiers, heavily intoxicated, mistook each other for enemies. Gunfire ensued. "Turks! The Turks are here!" yelled the drunken soldiers, firing at each other. Generals who had not made it across the river yet heard the gunfire and decided their army had fallen into an ambush. They ordered the artillery to fire upon their own troops. Darkness, alcohol, and panic took their toll. Thousands of Austrian soldiers, mistaking their comrades for enemies, killed each other. Some fell into the river while trying to flee from Turkish bullets and drowned. About 10,000 people were killed or wounded. When the real Ottoman troops entered the battlefield at dawn, they were met with a scene of total devastation. Thousands of dead bodies, shattered wagons, and smoking debris lay scattered. The Turks were bewildered. "What happened here?" they asked. "Where is the enemy?" Not a single Turkish soldier was on the battlefield. The attack from the opposing force that was supposed to occur the next day was thwarted by the Austrian army itself. They lost the battle without even starting it or encountering the real enemy. This battle became the most absurd in the history of wars, showing that sometimes the most fearsome enemy is not the one standing opposite you, but the one sitting beside you in the trench, especially if they have had a bit too much to drink. Our heroes fought against an imaginary adversary, but the next heroine faced a reality that was far more monstrous. She found herself alone in the midst of a hostile wilderness where every step could be her last, and she survived by learning not just to endure, but to see the world in a way that no one else had. Story number 8. The Seamstress Who Conquered the Icy Hell and a Cat. Wrangel Island, September 1921. Imagine a piece of rock in the Arctic Ocean where winter lasts 9 months and the wind can strip the flesh from your bones. An expedition arrives under the auspices of the famous polar explorer Vilhjalmur Stefansson. The aim is absurdly ambitious: to assert Canada's and Britain's claim over this uninhabited island by simply living there for a couple of years. The team consists of 4 young, enthusiastic Americans and 1 woman. Her name is Ada Blackjack. She is 11 years old. An Inuit, she was raised in a Methodist mission. She is terrified of polar bears to the point of fainting, cannot shoot, and has never lived in the wilderness. She was hired as a seamstress and cook. She needed money for her son's tuberculosis treatment. She thought she was going on a light adventure with experienced gentlemen. Little did she know she had bought a one-way ticket. The first year went reasonably well, but in the summer of 1922, the supply ship failed to break through the ice. The island was blockaded. Food was running low. The guys, confident in their invincibility, decided to make a mad dash across the ice to Siberia for help. 3 ventured into the white fog and disappeared forever. Their bodies were never found. Ada was left on the island with one of the Americans, Lauren Knight, who was too sick to move. And this is where the incredible transformation begins. The small, timid seamstress who once flinched at the sound of the wind found herself alone with a dying man and the expedition's cat named Vic. Knight, driven mad by pain and hunger, turned into a tyrant. He yelled at Ada, accused her of not trying hard enough, and demanded food. Ada took care of him, cleaned up after him, endured his insults, and learned how to kill. She took up the rifle. At first, she was afraid to pull the trigger, but hunger is the best teacher. She learned to set traps for Arctic foxes. She built a lookout tower from driftwood to spot bears before they could see her. This woman, who had never held anything heavier than a needle, began hauling heavy seal carcasses. In June 1923, Knight died. Ada was left completely alone. It was just her cat Vic, and 1,000 kilometers of ice. To keep from going insane in this ringing silence where the sky merges with the earth and the northern lights seem like a living entity, Ada started a diary. She typed on the typewriter left by the expedition. She talked to her cat. She talked to a photograph of her son. In moments of extreme exhaustion, when the boundaries of reality blurred, she felt that the colors around her had flavors, and the howling wind formed words. On August 19, 1923, after 2 years of isolation, the schooner Donaldson broke through to the island. The rescuers expected to find corpses. Instead, they saw a neatly sewn parka made of hides, a smoky hearth, and Ada, who came out to meet them, holding her cat in her arms. She hadn't just survived. She had preserved the expedition's equipment and diaries. Ada Blodgett returned home, healed her son, and lived a long life, avoiding fame. She always said, "I just wanted to live." And Vic, the only surviving Arctic cat who experienced such a Robinsonade, became a legend in small circles. Ada survived thanks to instincts she never knew she had, but our next hero survived against all logic, physics, and medicine. A projectile capable of killing an elephant entered his body. But instead of a funeral, this incident brought about a new era in understanding the human brain. This is story number 9, a personality wound. Cavendish, Vermont, September 13, 1848. A hot midday. A crew of workers is laying down a railroad by blasting through solid rock. They are led by Phineas Gage, a 25-year-old foreman whom the management considers the best in his field. He is as reliable as a rock, precise as a Swiss watch, and polite as a gentleman. He has a bright future ahead, but in a second, he will be left with only a bright past. Gage packs a charge of gunpowder into the hole. His tool is a special tamping iron. It's a terrible iron rod, over 1 meter long, 3 centimeters thick, weighing 6 kilograms, pointed at one end. Gage gets distracted by the conversation behind him, turns his head, and strikes the rock with the rod. A spark. The explosion happens instantly. The rod flies out of the hole like a projectile shot from a cannon. It enters Phineas under his left cheekbone, travels through his brain, pierces the skull at the top, and lands 25 meters away, covered in blood and bits of gray matter. Any other person would have died before their body hit the ground, but what happened next terrified the workers more than the explosion itself. Phineas Gage did not die. He was thrown back. He convulsed a few times and then sat up. After a few minutes, leaning on the shoulders of his stunned colleagues, he walked to the wagon to head into town. On the way, he calmly talked about the weather and the notes in the work journal. When Dr. Edward Harlow arrived at the hotel where the injured man was staying, Gage was sitting on the porch. Seeing the doctor, he spat out blood and, with grim irony, uttered a phrase that would go down in medical history. "Doctor, there is plenty of work for you here." Harlow looked at the wound on the man's head and saw a pulsating brain. He couldn't believe his eyes. The patient was conscious and reasoning clearly, despite having a hole in his head large enough for a billiard ball to fit through. Phineas survived. The wound became infected. He fell into a coma, but thanks to his incredible health and care from Dr. Harlow, he recovered. A couple of months later, he was walking around the city. Physically, he was healthy, but soon, friends and colleagues realized a terrible truth. Gage had survived, but Phineas had died. The iron rod that pierced his frontal lobes had conducted the most brutal lobotomy in history. The responsible, polite, and goal-oriented foreman had vanished. In his place was a capricious, rude, impatient, and foul-mouthed individual, unable to make plans for the future. Gage is no longer Gage, his acquaintances sadly concluded. He was fired from the railroad because he had become unbearable. He lived another 12 years, wandering the country, working as a coachman in Chile, and showcasing himself and his famous iron rod in Barnum's Circus in New York. He never parted with that iron, considering it his talisman. This case became the foundation of neurobiology. Gage, with his shattered life, proved that personality, character, and morality reside in specific areas of the brain, and they can be destroyed with one blow, leaving the body alive. Phineas Gage lost himself, but became immortal in textbooks. Now, the heroes of our next story lost nothing but their conscience. They created a mechanism that fooled emperors and scholars for half a century, making everyone believe that a machine could think better than a human. Although the secret was simple and as cramped as a coffin. Story number 10. The Chess Player Who Almost Didn't Breathe. Vienna, 1770. At the court of Empress Maria Theresa, all the elite of Austrian nobility gathered. In the center of the hall stood a marvel of technology, created by court advisor Wolfgang von Kempelen. It was a large wooden box with a life-sized puppet dressed in a Turkish kaftan and turban sitting behind it. The Turk held a long pipe in his hand, and in front of him was a chessboard. Von Kempelen, appearing like a magician, opened the doors of the box. Inside was a complex system of gears, levers, and brass cylinders. The audience gasped. This was pure mechanics, no deception. The inventor wound up the mechanism with a key, and the sound of springs creaking filled the air. The Turk slowly raised his hand, took a piece, and made a move. The game began. One of the courtiers sat down to play against the machine. The Turk played hard, aggressively, and flawlessly. If the opponent hesitated, the automaton would rap on the table and return the piece to its place. That evening, the mechanical man defeated all opponents. Vienna was in shock. The world had seen artificial intelligence for the first time. The Mechanical Turk went on tours across Europe and America. It defeated Benjamin Franklin in Paris. It checkmated Napoleon Bonaparte. The emperor, by the way, tried to cheat 3 times, and in the end, the Turk swept all the pieces off the board in protest. He drove Edgar Allan Poe crazy, who wrote an entire essay trying to unravel the mystery of the automaton. People believed that science had reached its peak, that gears could think. But the truth was far more prosaic and claustrophobic. Inside the box, there was no magical brain. There was a system of mirrors and a clever partition. When Kempelen opened one door, the inner mechanisms shifted, creating the illusion that the box was filled with machinery. In reality, there was enough empty space to accommodate a person, but not an ordinary person. Inside the stuffy dark box, curled up in a cramped position, sat a living grandmaster. Over the years, this role was fulfilled by the best chess players of Europe, Johann Allgaier, William Lewis, and Jacques Marais. They controlled the Turk's hand using a complex system of pantograph levers. They followed the game on a small board inside, receiving information through magnets under the main board. When a piece was lifted, a magnet was lowered. Imagine their work. Hours spent in an embryonic position, inhaling the smell of candle soot. A candle burned inside for lighting, and its smoke was channeled through a pipe in the Turk to mask the odor. Listening to the creaking of springs, drowning out their own breath and coughs. They were invisible, geniuses whose victories were attributed to a soulless puppet. One of the operators, it is said, was a war veteran who had lost his legs. Only then could he comfortably fit in the box. Another barely survived the heat during a performance. The Mechanical Turk was the greatest illusion of the Enlightenment era, proving that people were more willing to believe in a miracle machine than in the talent of a human hidden in a box. After 80 years, the automaton was consumed by fire in a Philadelphia museum. They say that just before the flames engulfed it, the Turk let out a strange sound, resembling a sigh of relief. The Turk deceived the elite, but our next hero did not try to fool anyone. He simply wanted to prove that a man is capable of everything, even if he has nothing but the will to live. He made an escape that will make you reevaluate the capabilities of the human body in absolute cold. Story number 11. The Escape from the Icy Grave. Siberia. Winter 1942. Gulag. A prison camp for prisoners of war, lost in the endless taiga, where the frost reaches -40 degrees. Here, Sławomir Rawicz, a Polish officer arrested by the NKVD on false charges of espionage, ended up. The sentence was 25 years of hard labor. In these parts, this meant a death sentence stretched over time. Here, people died of hunger, tuberculosis, and unbearable labor. An escape was considered impossible, not because of barbed wire, but because of the geography. Thousands of kilometers of snow, wolves, and lack of food. But Rawicz decided that it was better to die in a free snowdrift than as a slave in the lumber camp. On Easter night, when the guards relaxed their vigilance, Rawicz and 6 other prisoners, 3 Poles, a Latvian, a Lithuanian, and an American named Mr. Smith, cut the wire and disappeared into the blizzard. They had only a homemade knife, an axe, and a little bit of hardtack. Their plan was insane. They did not intend to go west, where the war was raging. They decided to head south, through Siberia, through Mongolia, through the Gobi Desert, across the Himalayas, into India. It was a death march spanning 6,000 kilometers. The first enemy was the cold. They slept closely huddled together to avoid freezing. They ate tree bark, caught snakes and frogs. Soon, they were joined by a runaway named Christina, a young Polish woman who had escaped from a collective farm. Now there were 8 of them. In Mongolia, they faced the heat and waterlessness of the Gobi Desert. Imagine the transition from Siberian frost to scorching sand. Christina was the first to die, unable to withstand dehydration. Then one of the Poles died. The survivors drank the blood of dead animals and kept walking, turning into living skeletons draped in parchment-like skin. Their shoes fell apart. They wrapped their feet in rags and skins, and then the Himalayas rose before them, walls of ice and stone. Without climbing gear, without oxygen tanks, and utterly exhausted, they began their ascent. In the mountains, they lost 2 more. They slept in snow caves, hallucinating from hypoxia. Ravitch later claimed that he saw strange creatures in the mountains, yetis, but no one knows if this was the truth or the product of a dying mind. 11 months after their escape, in March 1942, 4 survivors descended into India. They stumbled upon a British patrol. The soldiers could not believe their eyes. Before them stood beings resembling ghosts, with faces blackened from frostbite and long hair. Slavomir Ravitch had walked halfway across the world. His book, The Long Walk, became a bestseller. Although many researchers still debate the authenticity of certain details of the route, the fact remains that people escaped from the Gulag and survived in inhumane conditions, driven solely by the fury of life. This is a story about overcoming physical limits. But the next chapter will tell of overcoming moral boundaries. Our hero was an ordinary postal clerk until he decided he could become the Emperor of the United States. And the most astonishing part is that the people believed him. Story number 12. The Emperor who ruled without an army, but with love. San Francisco, September 17, 1859. A strange man entered the offices of the Bulletin newspaper. He wore a worn but tidy military uniform with gold epaulets. A rusty saber hung at his side. His gaze was clear, and his demeanor was majestic. He handed the editor a piece of paper and politely requested the publication of a proclamation. The editor, thinking it would be a great joke to fill a column, printed the text. The next morning, the city awoke to a new reality. The newspaper boldly announced, "I, Joshua Norton, by the request of the overwhelming majority of citizens of these United States, do hereby proclaim myself Emperor of this country." Thus began the kindest and most surreal chapter in American history. Joshua Norton was a bankrupt businessman who lost his sanity after a failed rice deal. Instead of sending him to a mental institution, San Francisco decided to play along. Norton I reigned for 21 years, a rule that many real monarchs would envy. He issued decrees that were printed in newspapers. He dissolved the Congress of the United States by the strength of his word, of course, because corruption thrived there. He ordered a bridge to be built between San Francisco and Oakland, which seemed absurd at the time, but that is exactly where the Bay Bridge was constructed. Half a century later, he imposed a tax on banks, and remarkably, the bankers paid. The city adored its emperor. Restaurants fed him for free, and in exchange, he placed a seal, blessed by imperial majesty, which instantly increased the flow of customers. Theaters reserved boxes for him. When his old uniform wore out, the city council allocated funds for a new outfit. Police officers saluted him in the streets. One day, a young patrol officer, new to the city, arrested Norton for vagrancy. The scandal was monumental. Newspapers cried out about the abuse of power. The police chief personally freed the emperor and offered public apologies. Norton, showing royal magnanimity, forgave the officer. From that moment on, every police officer in the city was obliged to greet His Majesty. Norton wasn't just the town madman. He was the conscience of the city. During anti-Chinese riots, he stood between the furious crowd and the residents of Chinatown. He didn't shout or threaten. He simply lowered his head and began to pray. The crowd, embarrassed by the sight of their beloved monarch, dispersed. He stopped the violence without a single shot fired. When on January 8, 1880, Norton I died in the street from an apoplexy, San Francisco plunged into mourning. 30,000 people, from millionaires to the poor, came to his funeral. The procession stretched for 3 kilometers. The headlines read, "The King is dead." Joshua Norton proved that power is not about harsh laws, but about the love and respect one gives to the people. Even if this power exists only in your mind, Emperor Norton ruled an imaginary empire in the real world. But the heroine of the next story ruled a real empire while being dead. Her coronation took place after her heart had stopped beating, and her subjects kissed the hand of her corpse as a sign of loyalty. Story number 13. The Queen Who Ascended the Throne from the Grave. Coimbra, Portugal, 1357. In the throne room of the cathedral, there is a suffocating silence. The entire nobility of the kingdom has gathered: knights, bishops. They are frightened. King Pedro I, known as the Cruel, sits on the throne. His gaze is mad and full of more. Beside him is a second throne. On it sits a figure in a luxurious gown adorned with jewels. A golden crown rests on her head. Her face is hidden behind a veil. The king rises and announces, "Greet your queen of death." He tears off the veil. The hall gasps. Beneath the veil lies the mummified face of a woman murdered 2 years prior. Her skin is dried, her eye sockets empty, but Pedro gazes upon her with the tenderness of a lover. This marks the climax of the most tragic and macabre love story in the history of Europe. Inez was a lady-in-waiting whom Prince Pedro fell in love with, but his father, King Afonso IV, opposed the union. Inez was Spanish, and the king feared the political influence of her brothers. Pedro, however, secretly married Inez, and they had children. King Afonso decided to tackle the problem in a radical way. While the prince was out hunting, he sent 3 assassins who beheaded her before the eyes of the children. When Pedro learned of his beloved's death, his sorrow turned into the fury of a berserker. He rose in rebellion against his father, laying waste to the north of the country. After his father's death, becoming king, Pedro's first task was to find those responsible and kill them. His vengeance was monstrous. He personally ripped hearts from their chests, one from the back, the other from the front, while they were still alive. But revenge did not bring Inez back, and then Pedro decided to do what even death could not. He ordered the exhumation of Inez's body from the Santa Clara monastery. He dressed the decaying corpse in royal garments and placed her on the throne. The coronation ceremony began. By the king's command, every courtier, every count and baron who had either despised Inez in life or remained silent when she was killed, had to approach the throne, kneel, and kiss the dried hand of the dead queen as a sign of loyalty. Imagine that horror, the stench of decay mixed with the scent of perfume, the cold bone against lips, and the mad gaze of the king watching every movement. To refuse meant death. After the ceremony, the body of Inez was transported with the highest honors to the Alcobaça monastery. Pedro ordered his sarcophagus to be placed opposite hers, feet to feet. His plan was simple and romantically thrilling. On the day of judgment, when the dead rise, the first thing Pedro would see upon opening his eyes would be the face of his beloved Inez. On the marble of their tombs, the inscription reads, "Ate o fim do mundo," until the end of the world. Pedro tried to conquer death with love, but our next hero defeated death simply by not showing up for it. He was the only man who arrived late to his own funeral, and this saved not only his life, but also that of a whole nation. Story number 14. The Man Who Slept Through the Eruption. Saint Pierre, Martinique, May 8, 1902. This is the Paris of the Caribbean, a thriving city full of life, trade, and laughter. Dominating it is Mount Pelée. The volcano had been smoking for several days, but the governor assured the residents that there was no danger. Elections were near, and evacuating the electorate was not in his plans. In the city jail sits Ludger Solboris, or Louis as he is called. He is neither a hero nor a villain, just an ordinary troublemaker. The day before, he had started a drunken fight and injured a friend with a saber. The police had thrown him into the most secure cell. A semi-underground, stone, solitary confinement cell with no windows, thick walls, and a narrow slit for air above the heavy steel door. Solboris was furious, shouting and cursing the judges, not knowing that this stone box was his only ticket to life. At 7:52 in the morning, the mountain erupted. It was not a slow flow of lava, it was a pyroclastic flow, a cloud of superheated gas, ash, and rocks rushing at a speed of 100 kilometers per hour. The temperature within the flow reached 1,000 degrees Celsius. It enveloped St. Pierre in mere seconds. The city vanished. Buildings ignited like matchsticks. People burned instantly, without even having time to realize what had happened. Barrels of rum exploded in the warehouses, adding to the fire. 30,000 people died in just 2 minutes. The water in the harbor boiled, destroying the ships. In his stone cell, Silbury felt the air suddenly become hot, like in an oven. The darkness became absolute. Scorching ash seeped through the crack above the door, burning his back, arms, and legs. He fell to the floor, covering his face with his sweat-soaked clothing to avoid inhaling the fiery death. He heard a roar that resembled the thunder of 1,000 trains, and screams that were cut off in an instant. And then there was silence. He spent 4 days in this searing grave without water, with severe burns, in complete darkness, surrounded by a dead city. He screamed, but no one could hear him because there was no one to listen. Only on the 11th of May did rescuers, digging through the ruins of the prison, hear faint moans from beneath the earth. Silbury was one of only 2 survivors in the downtown area. The other was the shoemaker Leon Comper Leander, who miraculously escaped to the outskirts. When he was rescued, he resembled a demon, coated in ashes and burns, but he was alive. The governor, who refused evacuation, perished along with everyone else, while the drunken inmate, who society had isolated as a dangerous element, became a celebrity. He was pardoned since all his accusers and witnesses were dead. Later, he joined Barnum and Bailey's circus, where he performed as the man who survived Judgment Day. He showed the audience his scars and recounted how the prison walls saved him from nature's wrath. Silbury survived thanks to the thick walls, but the heroes of our next story survived because they had no walls at all. They drifted in the open ocean on a piece of rubber, surrounded by sharks, eating whatever nature threw into their boat, proving that man is the most resilient creature on Earth. Story number 15. A family riding the waves on a rubber turtle. The Pacific Ocean, June 15, 1972. The yacht Lisette, a beautiful 12-meter schooner, is sailing from the Galapagos Islands to the Marquesas Islands. On board is the Scottish Robertson family, Dougal, the father, a former sailor, Lynn, the mother, their children, 18-year-old Douglas, 12-year-old twins Neil and Sandy, and a student traveler, Robin. They sold their farm to fulfill their dream of a round-the-world journey. At 10 o'clock in the morning, their dream turned into a nightmare. A deafening thud shook the vessel. A pod of killer whales, mistaking the yacht for a whale, attacked Lisette. The breaches were fatal. The yacht sank within 60 seconds. The family managed to throw overboard an inflatable life raft, a small fiberglass dinghy about the size of a bathtub, some water, oranges, and a sewing kit. 6 people found themselves in the middle of the largest ocean on the planet. The nearest land was 1,000 kilometers away, and the chances of survival were 0. They drifted for 38 days. Their water supply ran out after a few days. The sun burned their skin. But Dougal Robertson, a tough Scot, refused to let panic take over. He established strict discipline. They began to hunt. They caught flying fish that accidentally fell into the boat. They caught turtles with their bare hands. As the turtle swam toward the raft, they grabbed it by the flippers and pulled it aboard. The turtle's blood replaced their water. They ate the meat raw or dried it in the sun. They used the fat as a burn ointment. They even made enemas from murky water obtained from fish bones to absorb moisture through their intestines. It sounds horrible, but it saved their lives. On the 17th day, the inflatable raft began to fall apart. They had to move all 6 of them to Eden's tiny boat. Imagine, 6 people in a boat less than 10 feet long. The water was just 4 inches from the edge. They had to sit in turns, swapping places to keep the boat from capsizing. Dougal taught the children not to be afraid. He told them stories and encouraged them to keep a journal. Lynn, the mother, was the heart of the team, calming the twins. They became a single organism. On July 23rd, the Japanese fishing trawler Tokamaro spotted a strange object on the horizon. When the fishermen got closer, they couldn't believe their eyes. In the tiny boat sat 6 people. They were exhausted, covered in sores, in rags, but they were smiling. Dougal raised his hand and calmly asked to be taken aboard. They still had a little dried meat, turtle, and water left. Doctors later said that under those conditions, they could have lasted another month. The Robertsons didn't just survive. They proved that a family united by a common goal is stronger than the ocean. This case made it into survival textbooks, but our next hero survived in an environment where there is neither water, nor air, nor sharks. He became the first person to look into the eyes of infinity and wink at it while falling from a height where only satellites fly. Story number 16. The man who fell faster than sound and survived. New Mexico, August 16, 1960. Dawn. A huge helium balloon resembling a silver jellyfish ascends into the sky. Below it hangs a tiny open gondola. Inside sits Captain Joseph Kittinger. He wears a pressurized suit that makes him look like an awkward knight. His mission is to ascend to a height of 31 kilometers into the stratosphere, where the sky is already black and stars are visible even during the day. This is the Excels project. The U.S. Air Force wants to know if a pilot can survive from that height. Kittinger is their test subject. The ascent took 1.5 hours. At an altitude of 13 kilometers, his right glove lost pressure. His hand began to swell. Kittinger knew he had to report this to Earth and abort the mission. But he also knew he wouldn't be let back down. He remained silent. By the time he reached peak altitude, his hand was twice its normal size and incredibly painful, but he kept working. At 31,300 meters, he stood on the edge of the gondola. Far below was the blue planet. Above him was the cosmic void. He spoke into the microphone. "Lord, take care of me." And he stepped into the abyss. He fell for 4 minutes and 36 seconds. In the thin air of the stratosphere, there is almost no resistance. Kittinger accelerated to a speed of 613 kilometers per hour. He almost broke the sound barrier with his body. The wind did not whistle in his ears. There was no air to whistle. It was absolute silence. But then the nightmare began. He entered a spin. It began spinning at a monstrous speed. On his previous jump, yes, that was his third time, the rotation was so intense, 120 revolutions per minute, that he lost consciousness and was saved only by the automatic parachute. This time, he managed to stabilize the descent with a small brake parachute. He saw the black sky above smoothly transition to blue, then to white from the clouds. At an altitude of 5.5 kilometers, his main parachute opened. When he landed in the desert, medics rushed to him. Joseph removed his helmet. His face was pale, his hands swollen and bruised, but he was smiling. He became the first person to see the curvature of the Earth, not through a porthole, but with his own eyes, hanging in the void. His record stood for 52 years until it was broken by Felix Baumgartner. But Kittinger was the first. He jumped into the unknown, armed with the technology of the 1960s, a leaky glove, and nerves of steel. Kittinger fell from the skies, but the heroes of our next story emerged from the Earth to discover that the world they knew had vanished. They lived in isolation longer than a human lifetime. Unaware that World War II had ended, that Gagarin had flown into space, and that people had invented television. Story number 17. The Hermits Who Missed the 20th Century. Caucasia, summer 1978. A group of geologists flies by helicopter over the dense taiga in the upper reaches of the Abakan River. This spot on the map is marked as impassable. The nearest settlement is 250 kilometers away. Suddenly, the pilot notices a strange patch on the mountainside. It is a vegetable garden. Neat rows of potatoes in the middle of the wild thicket. The geologists decided to descend and check it out. They expected to find poachers or escaped criminals, but what they found was like a journey through time. On the bank of a stream stood a black, dilapidated hut covered with wooden shingles. An old man in rags with a beard down to his waist emerged from it. He was the boss. Behind him, 2 women hid who, upon seeing people, fell into hysterics, shouting something in an old Russian language. This was the Lyakov family, old believers. Karp Lyakov, his wife Akulina, who died of starvation in 1961, and their 4 children, Savin, Dmitry, Natalia, and Agafia. In the 1930s, fleeing collectivization and persecution for their faith, Karp took his family into the taiga. They went further and further away until they ended up in complete isolation. For 40 years, they had seen no one. The younger children, Agafia and Dmitri, were born in the forest. They had never seen bread. They didn't know what salt was. They had never seen a wheel. Their entire world was limited to the hut, the taiga, and the Bible, from which they learned to read. Their way of life was primitive. They made fire with flint, sewed clothes from hemp that they grew themselves. They made shoes from birch bark. When the metal cookware rusted, they learned to make pots from birch bark, which they could use to cook food. But the most shocking thing was their ignorance of history. When the geologists told them that there had been the Great Patriotic War, that Germany attacked Russia and was defeated, the Lyokovs shook their heads in disbelief. They had heard the rumble of airplanes in the sky, but thought it was a sign of the end of the world. When they were shown a television, Agafia was frightened, calling it a box of demons. But soon she watched it with childlike wonder. Contact with civilization became fatal for the family. They had no immunity to common viruses. In 1981, 3 of Savin's children, Natalia and Dmitri, died one after the other from pneumonia and kidney problems. Karp died in 1988, and Agafia Lakova was left alone. She was offered to move to a village or a monastery, but she refused. Here lies father, here lies mother. Where would I go? This is my home. She still lives in the taiga today, now as a very old woman, accepting help from volunteers and authorities, but refusing to leave her dead end. The Lykovs hid from the world to preserve their faith, but the world found them. Now, our next hero did not hide. On the contrary, he craved attention and recognition. And for that, he was willing to endure pain, humiliation, and even risk his life, becoming a living specimen for medical experiments that changed the understanding of what happens in our stomachs. This is the story of number 18, the man with a window in his belly. Mackinac Island, Michigan, June 6, 1822. Imagine a frontier of civilization at the edge of the wild world. A trading post of the American Fur Company, a noisy, dirty, and lively place where Native Americans, trappers, and traders exchange furs for flour, whiskey, and trinkets. Among this crowd stands 19-year-old Alexis Senon Martin, a young and robust French-Canadian voyager. He laughs, drinks, and is unaware that in a moment his name will enter medical history in the most painful way. Suddenly, there is a deafening crash. In a cramped shop, a gun accidentally fires. Alexis, standing just a meter from the barrel, takes a shot of buckshot in his left side. The injury was monstrous. A hole the size of a fist exposed broken ribs, part of a lung, and a punctured stomach, from which yesterday's breakfast spilled out. In the 19th century on the frontier, this was a definite death sentence. But at the fort served a young army surgeon named William Beaumont. Ambitious and curious, he decided to fight for the boy's life. Beaumont performed several surgeries, removed the buckshot, and repositioned the organs, and, against all odds, Alexis survived. But the wound healed oddly. The edges of the wound on his abdomen fused with the edges of the hole in the stomach, forming a fistula, a permanent open channel leading directly inside the organ. When Alexis recovered, a hole remained in his side, covered only by a flap of skin that could be lifted like a hatch cover to peer inside. At that moment, Dr. Beaumont realized the incredible gift fate had bestowed upon him. At that time, little was known about digestion. It was believed that food was ground in the stomach mechanically, like in a mill. Beaumont saw in Alexis not a patient, but a living laboratory. He hired the uneducated voyager as a servant and began a series of experiments that today would be considered torture. He tied pieces of meat, bread, and vegetables to a silk thread and lowered them into the stomach through the opening, like a fisherman casting bait into a mysterious pond. After several hours, he would pull out the thread and observe what happened to the food. He collected pure gastric juice simply by inserting a tube into a hole and sent it to chemists. He observed how the stomach reacted to different foods, to anger, and to fear. He conducted 56 experiments. For Alexis, these were years of humiliation. He felt like a circus freak. Beaumont was obsessed with science, while Saint-Martin wanted a normal life. He ran away from his benefactor several times, returning to Canada, getting married, and having children. But Beaumont, knowing there would never be another chance like this, sought him out and pleaded with him, sometimes even forcing him to return, even enlisting him in the army to keep him under control. Thanks to this strange and torturous alliance, William Beaumont became the father of gastroenterology. He proved that digestion is a chemical process and revealed to the world the secrets of gastric juice. Alexis Saint-Martin, the man with a window in his abdomen, outlived his tormentor by 27 years and died in old age, taking his anatomical anomaly to the grave. Alexis Saint-Martin became a living laboratory for the study of the body. But in our next story, we will discuss an experiment that was even more terrifying because its target was not the body, but the mind. It was an attempt to find the switch that erases identity and turns a person into a puppet. Story number 19. In Search of the Switch for the Soul. The United States, early 1950. The paranoia of the Cold War hung in the air like a thick, toxic fog. Every shadow seemed to harbor a Soviet spy. Nuclear apocalypse lurked around every corner. American soldiers returning from Korean captivity shared horrific tales of brainwashing. It seemed the communists had found a way to hack the human mind, turning enemies into puppets. In the dim offices of Langley at CIA headquarters, the gray cardinals in gray suits decided that they could not fall behind in this arms race. If the enemy could control the mind, then so could they. They needed to find the key to the human soul, or, if necessary, the lockpick. To protect democracy, they decided to slightly edit it within the minds of their own citizens. Thus, Project MKUltra was born. This was not a code name for an operation. It was the name of the darkest Pandora's box ever opened by the U.S. government. Under the leadership of chemist Sidney Gottlieb, whom colleagues privately referred to as the Black Sorcerer, the CIA began a series of illegal and monstrous experiments on people. Their goal was to find a substance or method that could control the mind, erase memories, evoke desired emotions, or break a person's will. They searched for that very switch that would turn a person into an obedient robot. The entire country became a testing ground. Doctors in 80 institutions, hospitals, universities, and prisons received funding from CIA front organizations. They administered large doses of LSD, mescaline, and other psychedelics to patients suffering from depression or schizophrenia without informing them. They subjected people to hypnosis sessions, sensory deprivation, and induced them into coma-like states lasting for days. But the most cynical experiment unfolded on the streets of New York City and San Francisco. As part of the Midnight Express operation, the CIA set up several brothels. The rooms were equipped with two-way mirrors and recording devices. Unwitting clients, ordinary American citizens, were secretly dosed with LSD while agents behind the mirror took notes, observing how the drug shattered their psyche. They wanted to see if they could make a person reveal their secrets under the influence of acid. The project lasted nearly 20 years. Thousands of people became unwitting test subjects. Many ended up in mental hospitals with shattered identities and erased memories. Some, like scientist Frank Olson, who was unknowingly slipped LSD in his drink, died under mysterious circumstances. When the scandal began to spill into the press in 1973, CIA Director Richard Helms ordered all documents related to MKUltra to be destroyed. Most records were burned, but a few boxes survived by mistake, becoming evidence that, in the pursuit of control over others' minds, one can easily lose one's own. The CIA sought to turn the human mind into a blank slate that could be rewritten. But what if nature created a mind that was the complete opposite? A mind that could not forget anything, turning every day lived into an indelible, eternal record. This is the story of Number 20, an archive that could not be erased. Moscow, the mid-1920s. Picture a noisy, smoke-filled newsroom of a major newspaper. The editor conducts a morning meeting, quickly and nervously issuing assignments. He lists dozens of names, addresses, and phone numbers. Journalists around frantically scribble with their pens and notebooks, afraid to miss even a single detail. All except one. In the corner stands a young reporter, Solomon Shereshevsky. He simply watches the editor, writing down nothing. His calmness appears as audacity. The editor, noticing this, explodes. "Shereshevsky, are you joking? Or do you have a phenomenal memory?" Solomon, feeling embarrassed, replies, "I guess so." To teach the slacker a lesson, the editor orders him to repeat everything that was just said. And Shereshevsky starts to repeat, word for word. He reproduces not only the list of addresses, but also random verbal slips, pauses, and even the editor's coughs. The newsroom falls silent. This is not memory. It is something else. The astonished editor sends Solomon to Alexander Luria, a young but already renowned Soviet neuropsychologist. Thus began their 30-year collaboration that revolutionized the understanding of human memory. Shereshevsky, or S as Luria referred to him in his notes, possessed absolute, limitless memory. But this was not a gift, it was a curse. His brain was a perfect hard drive without a delete button, which in the 1920s was more of a technical problem than an advantage. Every word, every number, every sound was not just memorized, they were imprinted in his consciousness with an eternal, multidimensional branding. His memory was synesthetic. For him, the number 1 was sharp and resembled an icy icicle. Luria's voice appeared to him as loose yellow gravel. The word restaurant brought to his mind images of people in tuxedos, the sounds of an orchestra, and the taste of roast beef. Imagine reading a book where every single word conjures up a storm of uncontrollable images, tastes, and sounds that completely overshadow the meaning of the text. He couldn't grasp abstract concepts because his mind did not know how to generalize. He remembered every detail, every specific case. He recalled the face of every passerby he encountered 20 years ago. His mind was an archive, constantly receiving new data, but from which nothing could be discarded. He desperately tried to learn to forget. He visualized unnecessary memories written on a board and mentally wiped them away with a cloth, but saw the remaining chalk stains. He imagined burning them, but instead saw the ashes and smelled the smoke. Nothing vanished. His life was a tragedy. He changed jobs dozens of times, but could not hold on to any. In the end, he became a professional mnemonist, a person who memorizes meaningless tables of numbers and formulas on stage. He turned his gift, his affliction, into a circus act. The man whose brain stored infinity was forced to entertain a crowd by memorizing the sequence of cards in a deck. Solomon Shereshevsky was a prisoner of a perfect mind, locked in a cell whose walls were made of his own memories. But our next heroes were prisoners of a perfect prison. A fortress on a rock in the middle of an icy bay, from which it was believed impossible to escape. They proved that even from the most hopeless place, there is a way out, if you have spoons, raincoats, and a brilliant plan. Story number 21. Freedom Carved Out with a Spoon. Alcatraz Island, 1960. This is not just a prison. It is the end of the line. A rock in the middle of the icy San Francisco Bay, battered by currents that could drag even an Olympic swimmer to the depths. From here, they say, there is no escape. Inmates can see the lights of the big city, hear laughter from passing yachts, but that world is as distant to them as Mars. The motto of Alcatraz is simple: break the law, go to prison. Break the rules of prison, end up with us. Here they bring Frank Morris. He is not a thug, not a killer. He is a thief with the intellect of a genius. His file reads IQ 130. Alcatraz for him is not a sentence, but a chess game in which he must find the only right move. Soon he finds partners, brothers John and Clarence Anglin, bank robbers with the hands of craftsmen. Together, they begin to prepare what is considered impossible. Their plan was bold, meticulous, and brilliant in its simplicity. They noticed that the concrete around the ventilation grates in their cells was old and crumbled from the salty, humid air. Their main tool became an ordinary spoon stolen from the cafeteria. Imagine this scene. Every evening in prison, it was music hour. Inmates were allowed to play musical instruments. And while someone was thrumming away on an accordion, playing a cheerful polka, Morris and the Anglins, covered with blankets, spent hours chipping away at the concrete with their spoons. The sound grated against the music. This was the most absurd escape symphony in history. To hide the gaps, they created fake grates out of cardboard. But how could they fool the night guards who checked the cells every half hour? The solution was worthy of a Hollywood film. In the prison barbershop, they collected hair. Using soap, toilet paper, and concrete, they fashioned head replicas. They painted them skin-colored with paint stolen from the workshop. At night, before going to bed, they placed these heads on their pillows. In the dim light of the corridor, with real hair, these dolls looked eerily lifelike. The guard shined his flashlight, saw a sleeping prisoner, and moved on. Behind the walls of their cells lay an old, abandoned service corridor. It became their secret highway. At night, they slipped out of their cells and climbed onto the roof of the prison block, where they set up a secret workshop. Their goal was to build a raft. From what? From 50 rubber raincoats that they had stolen one by one over the course of several months. They glued them together, and for the seams, they used heat from the steam heating pipes to vulcanize them. To inflate this rubber monster, they repurposed an accordion into a bellows. On the night of June 11, 1962, everything was ready. They placed the dolls in their beds, crawled through the holes, climbed onto the roof, and descended through the drain pipe. On the shore, they inflated their raft and set off into the dark, icy waters of the bay. No one ever saw them again. The next morning, the prison was in uproar. The FBI launched one of the largest manhunts in history. The official version, they drowned, but their bodies were never found. The legend states that they survived. Decades later, a letter, supposedly from an aging John Anglin, arrived at the police station, in which he confessed that they all made it. Whether this is true or not, no one knows. They simply vanished, leaving behind spoons, a rubber raft, and the greatest mystery in prison escape history. Morris and the Anglins carefully planned their flight into the unknown, spending months on it. But our next story is about the unknown that came without a plan or warning. It fell from the sky, leaving behind an unsolved mystery and a fallen forest the size of a large city. Story number 22. The day when the taiga saw a second sun. Siberia, the basin of the Podkamennaya-Tunguska River, June 30th, 1908, at 7 o'clock in the morning. The taiga was sleeping a deep primal sleep in which one century was indistinguishable from another, and the hunters were driving their reindeer. The air was clean and cold, and the silence was so dense that it seemed tangible. The world was eternal and unchanging. 17 minutes later, that eternity ended. In the sky from the southeast, a dazzling blue sphere appeared. It was brighter than the sun. It raced across the sky silently, cutting through the atmosphere, leaving behind a fiery trail. People hundreds of kilometers away from the epicenter fell to their knees, believing that Judgment Day had come. At an altitude of about 8 kilometers above the Earth, the object exploded. First came the flash. It was so powerful that a farmer in the village of Vivara, 65 kilometers from the epicenter, felt his shirt catch fire right on his body. Next came the shockwave. It knocked down 2,000 square kilometers of forest. 60 million trees fell like dominoes in a perfect radial pattern, with their roots pointing towards the center of the explosion. In homes within a radius of 200 kilometers, windows shattered. The sound of the explosion, reminiscent of the thunder of artillery, was heard from 800 kilometers away. Seismographs in Irkutsk recorded an earthquake. But the strangest part came after. The shockwave, circling the globe, was even registered in England. For several nights that followed, the sky over all of Asia and Europe glowed with a mysterious silvery light. In London, at midnight, one could read a newspaper without a lamp. Years passed, the First World War, revolutions, and the world had no time for the Siberian wilderness. It wasn't until 1927 that Soviet scientist Leonid Kulik, obsessed with the idea of finding a giant meteorite, made it to the site of the catastrophe. He expected to see a crater the size of a city, mountains of molten metal. He found nothing. No crater, no fragments, only millions of fallen trees. At the very epicenter, where the force of the explosion was directed straight down, the trees remained standing but were completely stripped of branches and bark, transformed into bare, eerie poles. A telegraph forest. What was it? A comet made of ice that evaporated completely in the atmosphere? A collision with antimatter? An experiment by Nikola Tesla? A miniature black hole? For over 100 years, no theory has fully explained all the facts. Nature, in a twist of fate, seemed to play a cruel joke on humanity. It left a huge scar on the planet, but didn't bother to leave a note with explanations. The sky left a scar on Earth, but offered no answers. Yet sometimes, the most unsettling mysteries arise not in fiery skies, but in the sterile silence of hospital rooms, where the human body itself becomes a source of inexplicable horror, turning rescuers into anxious victims. Story number 23. The smell of death from a syringe. Riverside, California, February 19, 1994. A typical evening in the emergency department. Doctors are exchanging tired jokes, nurses are distributing medications. The air smells of antiseptic and anxiety. At 9 in the evening, a woman is brought to the hospital. Her name is Gloria Ramirez. She is 31 years old. She is in the final stage of cervical cancer. She is unconscious, her breathing shallow, her heart beating irregularly. The doctors begin standard resuscitation, but from this moment, standard procedures come to an end, and a scientific horror begins. Nurse Susan Kane draws blood from Gloria's vein. She immediately notices something strange. The blood smells of ammonia. She hands the syringe to attending physician Julie McIntyre, who confirms the sharp chemical odor. Moreover, in the blood plasma, some whitish crystals, resembling semolina, float. And then the chain reaction begins. Susan Kane, the first to contact the blood, suddenly turns pale and collapses. A few minutes later, Julie McIntyre complains of dizziness and nausea, and then she too loses consciousness. Following her, respiratory therapist Maureen Welch also falls to the ground. Panic ensues in the department. People are collapsing one after another with similar symptoms: labored breathing, muscle spasms, dizziness, loss of consciousness. The hospital administration declares an internal emergency. All patients are evacuated to the parking lot. A team in hazmat suits arrives at the hospital. They place the body of Gloria Ramirez, who died despite resuscitation efforts, in a sealed container. That night, 23 people out of 37 staff members in the department were affected. 5 were hospitalized. Julie McIntyre spent 2 weeks in intensive care with liver issues and necrosis of her knee joints. An investigation was launched, raising more questions than answers. What was it? Mass hysteria? A toxic gas leak in the hospital? Or did Gloria Ramirez's body truly turn into biological warfare? The primary scientific theory later proposed sounded like a storyline from the X-Files. It was presumed that Gloria, suffering from pain, used dimethyl sulfoxide, a gel that was illegally applied as a painkiller. In her body, due to kidney failure, it could have transformed into dimethyl sulfate, an extremely toxic substance, a volatile poison. When doctors administered oxygen to her, and her blood cooled to room temperature, it could have triggered a chemical reaction that turned her blood into an aerosolized poison. But this is just a theory. The official conclusion stated mass hysteria. However, the doctors who nearly died that night do not believe in this version. For them, Gloria Ramirez will forever remain the toxic lady, a woman whose death became one of the most chilling medical mysteries of the 20th century. Gloria Ramirez's blood became a source of danger, but the hero of our next story voluntarily turned his blood into medicine. He allowed the deadliest snakes in the world to bite him hundreds of times, so his immune system would become a living factory for producing universal antivenom. Story number 24. The man whose blood became a first aid kit. Miami, Florida, 1948. The humid, sticky air of the South mingles with the scent of fear and reptiles. A crowd of tourists curiously peers into concrete enclosures housing cobras, rattlesnakes, and African mambas. At the center of this web of death stands a man. He is as calm as a monk in meditation. His name is Bill Haast. He is the owner of the Miami Serpentarium. And now he is about to do something that sends chills down the spine, even of the bravest. He will milk a cobra. He slowly hooks the snake with a stick, carefully takes it by the head, and brings it to a glass jar. The cobra opens its mouth, and 2 drops of thick yellow venom drip into the glass. The crowd applauds. They think this is just a trick, a dangerous show. They do not know that for Bill Haast, this is not entertainment. This is his life's mission, his religion, and his madness. Bill Haast has been obsessed with snakes since childhood, but he did not just collect them. He believed that the keys to curing terrible diseases, polio, multiple sclerosis, arthritis, were hidden in snake venom. And to prove this, he began the longest and most dangerous experiment in history, setting it on the only subject available to him, himself. Starting in the 40s, he began to introduce microdoses of poison into his body. First it was cobra venom, then mamba, and finally crates. Slowly, year by year, he trained his body to withstand deadly toxins. This process is known as mithridatism, but Haast took it to unimaginable heights. His immune system became frantic. It started producing antibodies of such strength and in such quantities that his blood turned into a universal antidote. Throughout his life, snakes bit him 172 times. Each bite, which would kill an ordinary person in a matter of minutes, was just another exam for his immune system. He lost fingers, and his hands swelled to the size of boxing gloves. He was several times on the brink of death, but each time his remarkable body pulled through. The snakes, one must say, were not thrilled with his scientific pursuits and expressed their opinions in the only way available to them. But here is where madness turned into miracle. When tragedies involving children occurred around the world, when a rare snake bit in the jungles of Venezuela with no antidote available, or when a herpetologist at a zoo was struck by the venom of an exotic viper, a call would ring out in Miami. Haast's blood became the last hope. His plasma was frozen and sent across oceans by airplane. He personally saved the lives of more than 20 people, becoming for them a donor not just of blood, but of life itself. Bill Haast lived to be 100 years old, a man who flirted with death all his life and voluntarily injected it into his veins, outlived most of his critics, and passed away in his bed. Bill Haast turned his inner world, his blood, into a work of art that saves lives. But our next hero did not look inward. He looked beneath his feet, and from the garbage that others overlooked, spent 33 years building a palace that is still considered a wonder of architecture and perseverance. Story number 25. The man who built skyscrapers from shards. Los Angeles, 1921, the Watts neighborhood. A dusty, impoverished place where dreams, if born at all, quickly die under the scorching California sun. This is where Simon Rodia lives, a small, wiry Italian immigrant. By day, he is an ordinary laborer, laying tiles and mixing cement, and no one pays him any mind. But in the evening, when the city lights come on, Simon returns to his tiny, triangular plot of land and begins his real work. The work he will dedicate the next 33 years to. His neighbors consider him crazy. Every day, returning from work, he does not rest. He wanders along the railroads, through junkyards, and on the beaches, collecting trash. Broken glass from 7-Up bottles, shards of porcelain plates, seashells, rusty pipes, pieces of mirrors. He drags all this junk home, and from this garbage, he begins to build. He has no blueprints, no engineers, no construction machinery. All he has are his hands, a bucket of cement, and a vision in his mind. He starts erecting lace-like towers that resemble the skeletons of dinosaurs. His main material is steel rebar, which he bends with his bare hands, using the rails of the nearest railroad as a lever. He does not use scaffolding. He climbs up his creations like a spider, rising higher and higher, coating the remaining framework with cement and decorating it with a mosaic of collected shards. Years pass. Children laugh at him and throw stones. Adults shake their heads. Authorities try to stop him, deeming his constructions dangerous, but the towers continue to grow. They stretch towards the sky, sparkling in the sunlight with thousands of fragments, transforming trash into a work of art. The tallest tower reaches 30 meters, about the height of a 10-story building. He names his creation Nuestra Pueblo, our town. This is his personal cathedral, built from the refuse of consumer society. In 1954, after 33 years of daily hard labor, 75-year-old Simon Rodia descends from his tower for the last time. He silently gifts the lot to a neighbor, gathers his belongings, and leaves, never to return. He did not explain his actions. He simply said, "I wanted to do something big." And I did. But the story doesn't end here. The city authorities decided to demolish the dangerous towers. In 1959, they brought a powerful crane to them, tied them with cables, and pulled. The cable tightened, squeaked, and broke. The towers didn't even budge. They turned out to be stronger than the engineers thought. This test of strength became their legitimization. Today, Watts Towers is a National Historic Monument, a symbol that one person, armed only with stubbornness and a dream, can build from garbage something that will outlast him. Simon Rodia proved that from the debris of other people's lives, one can build a cathedral that reaches for the sky. But our next hero built not with stone, but with sounds. He tried to conceive a language that would unite humanity, but instead, his creation became a target for the most brutal regimes in history, who saw the idea of universal peace as the main threat. Story number 26. The War Against the Language of Hope. Bialystok, Russian Empire, the late 19th century. Imagine a melting pot of a city where Russians, Poles, Germans, and Jews stew in their own soup. They live on neighboring streets but speak different languages. They look at each other with suspicion and are ready to tear each other's throats over any small issue. In this atmosphere of mutual hatred grows a boy idealist named Ludwig Zamenhof. He sees how the language barrier turns neighbors into enemies, and an idea is born in his mind. A dream of a simple neutral language that belongs to everyone and to no one in particular, a language that would serve as a bridge between peoples. For 20 years, he secretly worked on his project. By day, he was an ophthalmologist treating people's eyes, and by night, he tried to give humanity new vision, a new way to see each other. In 1887, he finally published his work under the pseudonym Dr. Esperanto, Dr. Hopeful. Thus, the language of hope was born. Esperanto was brilliantly simple, straightforward grammar, no exceptions, and international vocabulary. The idea ignited like a wildfire. Esperanto clubs began to emerge around the world. People from different countries, who would never have been able to converse, suddenly began to write letters to each other, travel, and meet at congresses. They felt like pioneers of a new, better world, where there would be no warriors because everyone could come to an agreement. They were as naive as children and did not know that tyrants hate universality more than anything else. The first blow was struck by Hitler in his book Mein Kampf. He called Esperanto the language of Jewish conspirators who wanted to mix nations and destroy the Aryan race. When the Nazis came to power, a hunt began for Esperantists. They were arrested and sent to concentration camps. The Zamenhof family was almost completely wiped out. Speaking Esperanto in Germany meant signing one's own death warrant. But the irony was that on the other side of the barricades in the Soviet Union, the same thing was happening. In the 1920s, Esperanto was popular among the Bolsheviks, who saw it as a tool for world revolution. But in the 1930s, Stalin changed his mind. He viewed Esperantists as a dangerous, uncontrollable network of spies. People who corresponded with foreigners could not be loyal Soviet citizens. Mass arrests began. Esperantists were executed on charges of participating in an international espionage organization. Imagine the absurdity of the situation. A language created for peace became a cause for death. The Nazis killed for it because they considered it Jewish. Communists killed for it because they considered it cosmopolitan. Two of the most brutal regimes of the 20th century, hating each other, converged in their hatred of the idea of simple human communication. But the language survived. It went underground, outlived its executioners, and exists to this day as a quiet monument to the dream of a doctor from Bialystok. Zamenhof tried to build a bridge between people, but his bridge came under fire. The hero of our next story also built a bridge, but not a metaphorical one, a real one. And to prove its reliability, he made his family stand beneath it while a heavy train crossed it for the first time. Story number 27. A Bridge Bound by Love and Fear. Cincinnati, Ohio, 1889. The city is buzzing with anticipation for a miracle. Above the deep gorge of the Kentucky River looms a steel monster, the tallest railway bridge in North America. It is a delicate, frightening structure made of iron and rivets that seems too fragile to withstand a multi-ton steam locomotive. People gaze at it with a mix of awe and horror. Newspapers are filled with grim predictions. The bridge will collapse under the first train, taking dozens of lives with it. The engineer who created this marvel is a German immigrant named John Roebling, but he is currently occupied with another project, the Brooklyn Bridge. He entrusted the completion of the bridge in Kentucky to his son, Washington Roebling. However, due to caisson disease, Washington is bedridden. Then, a woman enters the scene who will go down in history as the first female field engineer. Her name is Emily Warren Roebling, wife of Washington. For several years, it is she who leads the construction. She studies material science, relays her husband's instructions to the workers, and solves the most complex engineering problems. Male engineers look down on her, but she proves her competence. And so the bridge is ready. But fear remains. The public does not believe that this web will hold. The railway company is nervous. Any disaster would bring an end to their reputation. They needed to do something that would convince everyone of the absolute reliability of the bridge. And then, Emily makes a decision that would make a modern engineer's heart stop. On the day of the first test, when two heavy locomotives were supposed to slowly cross the bridge, she takes her little son, John Roebling II, and stands with him right under the central arch of the bridge. Imagine this scene. Hundreds of people, holding their breath, watch from the shore. Slowly, two steaming locomotives move from one side of the ravine. Their wheels clatter as they hit the bridge. The structure begins to vibrate and hum, and down below, at the most dangerous point, stands a fragile woman holding her child's hand. Her face is calm. She looks up at the creation of her family. With this gesture, she tells the world, "I believe in this bridge so much that I am willing to risk my child's life. I believe in my husband's calculations. I believe in my work." The trains slowly cross the bridge. Silence is replaced by thunderous applause and shouts of "Hurrah!" No one doubted the reliability of the bridge anymore. Emily Roebling not only proved the strength of the structure, she showed that sometimes the most convincing argument is not numbers and formulas, but boundless faith. Emily Roebling risked everything for the future she was building. But our next hero built nothing. On the contrary, he demolished the most secure castles in the world to prove that any security system has a weak point. And that weak point was himself. Story number 28. An artist whose stage was a prison cell. The end of the 19th century. The world was swept up in a craze for spiritualism, tricks, and illusions. But among the hundreds of magicians pulling rabbits out of hats, a figure of a different scale emerged. His name is Harry Houdini. He is not just an illusionist, he is an escape artist, a master of escape. His tricks are not sleight of hand. They are a tribute to the human body, mind, and will, which can overcome any chains, locks, and walls. Houdini's fame echoed around the world, but skeptics whispered, "It's all rigged. The locks are tampered with. The assistants are bribed." Houdini decided once and for all to prove that he is the best. He challenged every prison and police station in the world. His standard act looked like this. He would arrive in a town, go to the local police station, and offer a wager. "Lock me up in your best shackles, put me in the most secure cell, and if I don't get out in 1 hour, I will give you $1,000. The police, confident in their locks, eagerly agreed. Houdini was stripped naked to ensure he had no hidden picks. He was bound in chains, handcuffed, and sometimes even fitted with special transport shackles designed for the most dangerous criminals. Then he was thrown into the cell and the steel door was locked. Journalists and a crowd of onlookers waited outside. Minutes passed, sometimes even half an hour, and suddenly the cell door would burst open, and a smiling, completely naked Houdini would appear at the threshold, holding the removed shackles in his hands. Sometimes, for added effect, he would emerge and then jokingly lock his jailers in nearby cells. How did he pull this off? It was a combination of incredible physical fitness, brilliant lock mechanics knowledge, and psychology. He could dislocate his shoulder to free his hand. He could control every muscle in his body. But his main weapon was hidden where no one would think to look. He would swallow small picks and springs, then induce vomiting in his cell to retrieve them. Sometimes he hid them under his nails or in his thick hair. His most famous prison escape occurred in Washington. He was locked in a cell with Charles Guiteau, the assassin of President Garfield. It was believed to be impossible to escape from it. Houdini freed himself in 2 minutes, but there was one time he almost lost. In England, he was locked in a cell with a new intricate lock that he couldn't open. An hour passed. The crowd started to laugh. Exhausted and humiliated, Houdini was ready to give up, when he simply pushed the door. It turned out the jailer, confident in the complexity of the lock, had simply forgotten to lock it. Houdini turned the humiliation of confinement into a triumph of freedom. He proved that the most reliable lock is the one that exists in our minds. But our next hero didn't try to escape from prison. He was trying to escape from an entire army. And for this, he had to cross mountains considered impregnable, leading not soldiers, but war elephants. Story number 29. The Man Who Led Mountains to War. Spain, 2018 years before our era. Imagine an army stretching for miles. 90,000 infantry, 12,000 cavalry, and, most incredibly, 37 war elephants. These gray mountains of flesh and fury, clad in armor, instilled terror just by their presence. At the head of this armada was a young Carthaginian general named Hannibal Barca. Since childhood, he had sworn on an altar to be an eternal enemy of Rome, and now he was about to fulfill his oath. The Romans were confident in their invulnerability. The sea protected them from the south and the Alps from the north, an impregnable wall of ice and rock, through which, Roman senators believed, not even a goat could pass, let alone an entire army. They calmly awaited Hannibal on the coastline, planning to crush him in a naval battle. But Hannibal had no intentions of playing by their rules. He looked north at the white peaks of the Alps and made a decision that is still considered the peak of military madness and genius. He decided to flank Rome from the rear, through the mountains, with elephants. The crossing began, taking 15 days and costing him half of his army. It was not just a march, it was a battle against nature itself. Soldiers and animals scrambled up narrow icy paths where one misstep meant falling into the abyss. They were attacked by hostile mountain tribes who set ambushes and rolled stones down on them. The elephants, unaccustomed to the cold and altitude, roared in fear and pain. They slipped on the ice, fell, blocking the path. Imagine this scene. African warriors in light clothing, accustomed to the heat, struggling to survive in a snowy alpine storm. Hannibal marched ahead, encouraging his men, finding ways around obstacles, and personally chopping a path through the ice. At one point, a rock slide blocked the road. According to legend, Hannibal ordered a massive fire to be lit to heat the stones, and then poured sour wine on them to make them crack. When the weary, diminished army descended into the valley of the Po River in Italy, the Romans could hardly believe their eyes. The enemy appeared where they never expected it. It was akin to seeing an enemy fleet landing from the moon. The panic that swept through Rome was matched only by Hannibal's genius. He crossed the Alps, losing almost all of his elephants. Only one survived, his beloved Surus, on which he rode. But he achieved his goal. He brought the war to the enemy's doorstep, and for the next 15 years, tormented Italy, dealing the Romans one crushing defeat after another. Hannibal did not conquer Rome, but he forever entered history as the man who proved that there are no insurmountable obstacles for a great cause, not even mountains. Hannibal moved mountains to wage war, But the hero of our next story moved mountains alone to carve a road to his village in the name of love. This is the story of a man who chipped away at a rock with just a hammer and a chisel for 22 years. Story number 30, The Mountain That Didn't Know Who It Was Dealing With. India, Bihar, 1960. The village of Galore is a place that the gods forgot to mark on the map. The mountain was not just a backdrop, it was a sentence. It dictated who would live and who would die without waiting for help. Every day she made the dangerous journey across a narrow mountain path to bring him lunch in the fields. This was their ritual, their small— She was severely injured and pregnant. Dashrath carried her on his shoulders and ran, but he had to take the long route. He looked at the mountain that took everything from him, and quietly said, "I will not rest until I break you." Every day, from sunrise to sunset, one man with one hammer chipped away at the rock. At first, the village laughed at him. "Manji has gone mad with grief," they whispered. Children threw stones at him. His own father begged him to stop this madness, but Dashrath did not listen. He simply worked. He worked under the scorching sun that melted stones. He worked during the monsoon season when torrents of water threatened to wash him into the abyss. When he had no food, he chewed on leaves. When he had no water, he drank from dirty puddles. His body was covered in scars, and his hands turned into solid calluses. The mountain seemed to pay no attention to his efforts, coldly gazing at this tiny, toiling figure. But a drop wears away a stone not by force, but by persistent falling. And then, in 1982, after 22 years of solitary struggle, the last stone fell. Dashrath Manji single-handedly carved a path in the mountain that was 110 meters long and 9 meters wide. He reduced the journey to the town from 55 kilometers to 15. One man, driven by love and fury, accomplished what the government lacked both the funds and will to achieve. He didn't just pave a road, he built a monument of love, etched into the heart of a mountain that dared to stand in his way. And with this, we close our archives. 30 stories, 30 proofs that reality is the most inventive, cruel, and compassionate storyteller. We have seen a man become a tree to deceive the enemy, a dead queen take an oath of loyalty, and a drunkard in a jail cell experience the apocalypse. We learn that love can break through rock, and will can transcend the stratosphere. The human spirit is the most unpredictable and indomitable force in the universe. It can build a palace from garbage and lose a battle to a barrel of schnapps. It can survive in an icy hell and go mad from perfect memory. It can rule a non-existent empire and single-handedly conquer a mountain. I hope these chronicles have made you see the world differently. For the most incredible stories happen not on the pages of books, but right here, in this strange, frightening, and beautiful world where absolutely anything is possible. Until we meet again in the twilight zone of history.